those individual rhythms can then be harnessed and coalesced to move together. It's more like a symphony than it is like a marching army, if that makes sense. So the question is, as individuals, into what kind of flow do we place ourselves? What is the rasa that we will be a part of? Baba's suggesting the right inspiration is samasamashta, moving together in unison as a society. Being important. These 5 practices, I don't know if everyone has the card, but I can do just a little quick mapping how I read them. I don't think it's perfect, but nevertheless, I'll do my best. But the idea of inspiration, that you have a kind of flow, samasamashtattva, is, for me, the best way that I can map this is number 4. Live in a way that your understanding of the unitary nature of the universe is your guiding principle. The reason I say this is that this notion of samasamashtattva as being social equality. Okay? This does not mean that everyone is just equal in all respects. Rather, it is an understanding that each unique expression of the divine has its own purchase in life, its own right to survive, its own rhythmic contribution to make, and so on. And if we can see in all other beings that divine aspect that is manifest in them, and grant that some kind of space to develop and express, then that is the kind of equality that we're talking about. I'll maybe come back to this, but it's a kind of unity of diversity. And so in order to live in a way that your understanding of the unitary nature of the universe is your guiding principle, we have to be able to see all of manifest reality as integrated and as one expression of these unique tendencies, these unique divine attributes, if this makes sense. And so that's why I map it to, if I am inspired to move in a kind of harmony or rhythm with other beings, then I have to be able to recognize that unitary quality that we share as a principle. I can say more about this in a minute. Capacity and strength, number 1 and number 3. Live your life according to the highest standards of ethics and morality. You must develop these capacities and strengths. Absolutely essential. Number 3, apply logic and rationality to all sentiments, so that you think, speak, and act in a way not to bring harm to another and to better all others. Again, developing that intellect, that discriminatory capacity, essential. The goal, number 2, engage in spiritual practices to deepen your connection to and understanding of the divine unifying consciousness. If we don't develop that, how can we reach our goal? And again, number 5, engage yourself as an active participant in educating others. This is a form of seva, I would argue. And why would I classify this as being part of the goal? Precisely because earlier we noted that we cannot know what merging or liberation or salvation is until we've attained it. But along the way, we can serve Prana Purusha in all that we do through our acts of seva. And that, I would argue, is a form of reaching our goal.
This is also, it seems to me, bringing goal into a collective sense. That there is a reorientation here of philosophy beyond just individual attainment of spiritual goal to collective endeavor to support all in moving towards spiritual goal.
Correct.
And that there becomes a more and more unified, merged effort to move toward that. And number 5, I think, becomes essential to bring that aspect of goal about.
Indeed. Indeed. We can't, there's many sayings Sarkar has, like you can't hoard this knowledge. You can't shut yourself up in ivory towers, which is symbolic of your own understanding. You must share this with others. You must educate others. You must help them see those who are trying to manipulate them and exploit them. And in our own selves too. We must have a great understanding of the ways in which we ourselves participate in the very acts and the very kinds of problems that we are seeking to overcome. And so this education piece. So I argue that this seva is a form of achieving the goal. This is what we can do now on that movement towards the goal. In each and every act of greeting another person, we say namaskar. This is our fundamental reminder that we are always, in everything we do, in each encounter, we are connecting with the unifying consciousness. Namaskar. That which is divine in me, he says, bringing to that which is divine in you. The namaskar is our daily reminder of this fundamental fact. Even though the divine, I'm getting spontaneous now, even though the divine manifests in all these diverse forms, nevertheless, this movement that we're talking about is occurring, and there's always an attraction. Each and every entity has an attraction to other entities. And why is that? Precisely because it is all part of that unifying consciousness in this movement. And so the namaskar is our daily active reminder of that. And if in our social and professional lives, I mean, I don't go around on campus and namaskar, colleague. I don't do that because that's not fitting for that setting. But do I have to do the gesture of namaskar in order to do a namaskar? Can I not, in my mind, do a namaskar for each person that I encounter, each being that I encounter? So this fundamental practice can be there. Guru mantra would be another practice of this constant reminder. And then, of course, acting accordingly, not just in thought, but in the words we speak. It says very clearly here, not just in acts, but in words, or not just in thoughts, but in what we speak. And so how we interact with others, how we act in accordance with them can all be manifestations of this underlying connection that we see, and so forth. Very important. So, that's how I map these principles. That's how I map Bhagavad Dharma, these principles, and so on to these fundamental three factors of movement, so that there be inspiration, capacity, strength, and a goal. Now, I would like to say a bit more about Sama Samaj Tattva and equality, because this is not the only form or source of inspiration. There is another fundamental source of inspiration for people. There's another term. Atma Sukha Tattva. What is Atma Sukha Tattva?
Principle of selfish pleasure.
Principle of selfish pleasure. So now, we need to understand this relationship, I think. Baba says that all beings have a thirst for happiness. This gives rise to passion, yeah? A thirst for happiness. Is this not a kind of selfish pleasure? What do we think?
Not if
Is there a contradiction? Is there a paradox?
Not if your desire for happiness is a desire for all to be happy. If it's like, you know.
So you're suggesting that it's collective, as Robbie said. There's a collective aspect.
Yeah, it can be the personal, somewhat selfish, or the more expansive, the universal, which is wishing that on others, especially when you feel so nice inside. It is a natural feeling to want to tell others about it, show them it, and give it to them.
Good.
It depends on what you derive your happiness from. If you believe that some really deep happiness will come from having a new car with all the whistles and bells, it won't help others. But if your happiness comes from merging with the Supreme, and yes, individually you're feeling this bliss, but you're broadcasting it out, you're like a radio station. And so everywhere around you is just saturated with positivity because you are immersed in positivity and bliss.
Thank you for these words, positivity, negativity. What is it that is, so, what is derived, what attracts you? The word attraction. I already mentioned there's this movement of everything. attracts this fundamental thirst for happiness. So I would argue, and Baba is saying, or suggesting that there are two paths that this fundamental thirst can take. One is atma sukha, selfish pleasure. Secondly, it is sama samaj tattva, a kind of social equality or a collective movement or realization of this happiness. Okay? I think it is really important that there's something of value in both of these. The value in selfish pleasure, I would argue, is survival. There's a fundamental will to survive in living beings that we can never forget. I mentioned if you try to suppress your breath, your body will react against you. There is a certain, the word is autopoiesis, but forget that. But there's a certain self-preservation mode that all beings have. We can't forget that. But at least amongst human beings, where instinct for survival can be more finely and subtly expressed, there is also a will to fulfill, or a will to thrive, if you want to use that word. The question is, do we just run with our will to survive and let that develop and expand into selfish pleasures and happinesses and so on? Or do we cultivate this larger collective capacity? Baba says the sacrifice going this way is you may not get all the personal pleasures you want, but you can attain peace and spiritual development and growth. So there's the kind of trade. But both of these I think are important. Atma Sukha Tattva is not just, there's something fundamental to it, survival.
I'm going to push back a little bit.
Push back.
So Manu gave the translation, principle of selfish pleasure. And not as opposed to a principle of just self-gratification. I think it is the seeking of happiness that is divorced from the well-being of others. Now, so the question comes, is that really a path to survival? And there's, as you, Lisa's aware of, as I am, more and more literature, research that has backed away from sort of the early Darwinian, Aldous Huxleyan type notions of the evolutionary thrust to show that we are dependent upon cooperative understandings, cooperative behaviors to really find survival.
Yes. I see, yes.
What was your question again? Can you...
It's not that Atma Sukha Tattva is the path of survival. It's that it is an expression of the will to survive. That is a very limited expression. But it's always going to be,
fundamentally it is incorrectly directed.
it is incorrectly directed. Yes, but
But it makes
it's
sense
built
what you're
on the will to survive that it
That's the
entity has.
impetus at first.
Okay? And so that entity, if it does not reflect, if it does not discriminate properly, if it does not develop ethics and morality and so on, that entity will tend to seek little ways to survive that become selfish. I'll get into this in a moment. So I don't want to suggest that it's either, I don't want to say it's grounded in the will to survive. But if we want to take the will to survive with us, the will to survive always has to be coupled with the will to fulfill. The will to live and fulfill is how I like to express it. We have to bring that with us into this other path that you're suggesting. Because ultimately, I'm getting ahead of myself, but ultimately if we go down Atma Sukha Tattva, it's always a dead ending. It's always a stagnant pool of non-movement at the end of it. And I'll wanted to make this distinction that Atmasukha Tattva is grounded in something very fundamental about life, which is a will to survive. But it takes a wrong expression or path of that, if that makes sense. It becomes parasitic on others ultimately, as opposed to serving others.
And it should be discriminated between just the desire to experience something versus survival.
This is also true.
If
This
I
gets
just
into
wanted to eat a lot of marshmallows because I love marshmallows, that's not survival.
This gets into fine, but yes.
I think an example of what you're saying about that will to survive is this thought current that we see in our society now of a certain group of people who want to build a big wall and we don't want anybody to come in, and I've got to take care of myself and my family. It's like this thing in their mind that they think to survive means to
Okay,
deny
good.
existence to
So
others.
This gets
warped
into,
perception.
absolutely. So now this gets into what happens here. So Atmasukha Tattva, Samsamaj Tattva are both inspirations or impetuses of movement. Right? Baba gives two terms as to the types of movement these are. Bhavananda has already given us a hint of this. He mentioned positivity. So the distinction here is between vidya and advidya.
Yes, there we go.
Okay? Vidya is a centrifugal type of movement. It tries to bring something closer to its radius. Advidya is a different kind of stir or movement. It is centripetal. To move in that way is to get farther away from the radius. Now, Samasamaj Tattva is a form of vidya movement to bring us closer to the radius, which is the cosmic hub.
Closer to the nucleus.
The nucleus, excuse me, wrong word. The cosmic hub, Parma Purusha, and so on. Atmasukha Tattva isn't just movement away from that. Atmasukha Tattva is like creating a little eddy somewhere along the way that gets you stuck. Like a little pool where you can't move closer to the center anymore. It becomes its own little nucleus, so to speak. It builds this little pool that is propped up and supported by dogma. What is dogma?
Irrational.
Dogma is ultimately irrational, but dogma has a kind of logic to it. Dogma is the building of a kind of boundary or circle around something.
Mm-hmm.
It then sets rules about what's included and what's excluded. It sets rules about what's virtue and vice according to its own needs. It sets rules about who belongs and who does not belong. And then it enforces those boundaries. And so this gets into things like race and class distinctions and caste distinctions and so on. And so I would argue that Atmasukha Tattva, it kind of creates, I like to call it a little fiefdom. It's like a little, it tries to create its own little kingdom to assert itself and its power over others. But ultimately this is a dead ending because it's not properly goal-oriented. It's not propped up with the right kinds of energies. It becomes a stagnant pool. It loses movement. And people's minds get sucked up in it. They go round and round. They demonize others. But there's no true movement. Another aspect of this is something you mentioned about my happiness. Is it for a car? Is it for Parma Purusha? And so Baba makes this distinction as well. The distinction between kama and prema. Kama is an attraction to limited physical objects. So what attracts me? Is it money? Is it fame? What is it that attracts me? If that's my goal, then that's different than Parma Purusha, which is prema. P-R-E-M-A, prema. That's the cosmic attraction, and that's universal love. So if you begin to, yes.
I'm seeing it a little bit as what are animal tendencies versus human. Animal not being negative, but for an animal to be attracted to food is survival. For an animal to claim a certain amount of territory so it has enough food for it or its people, its herd, is survival. And there it's really a good thing. For a human that's more influenced by animal mind, possibly due to their level of their incarnation, then applying animal types of thinking, of approaches, becomes very deleterious to society.
Yeah, there's, I think there's merit to that, but I've been wondering whether the translation that was given is principle of selfish pleasure. And the word pleasure gets used rather than survival.
Yes?
And I think it goes beyond. So, I mean, many things, if you strip away the veneer, of course, it comes down to survival. But some of it gets way beyond what we think of as survival. There are those who cultivate tantric yogic powers to be able to psychically manipulate others. There are those who engage in scientific inquiry to establish supremacy of ego
Yes.
and knowledge and things like that. So that's what I have a preference for this term, for putting the focus on pleasure.
Yeah, also the word selfish is very important. It's not just seeking pleasure, it's seeking selfish pleasure, which is
Yes.
usually associated with, I want something so that somebody else can't have it, or that my status is greater than your status because I have this. In other words, depriving others because of your desire.
It's probably because how I introduced this is incorrect. So my argument is that there's a fundamental will to survival and fulfillment that living beings have. And it can take the direction of Atmasukha Tattva or Samasamaj Tattva. If it takes Atmasukha Tattva, yes, it's survival, but the fulfillment piece is still there. And that's the pleasure-seeking piece of it. But it becomes a limited kind of thing. It becomes an attraction for fame, wealth, whatever it might be. And that inevitably, because of the nature of reality, to do that is to then create exclusionary zones or to create these boundaries. And so capitalist exploitation is an excellent example of this, where it builds upon this selfish pleasure, and and the only way to fulfill that and go after money is to exploit others to generate that wealth and capital. They do that work, and that capital is then taken and controlled by the capitalists as well. And so then it's ultimate. It's why it becomes this little fiefdom, I call it, if this makes sense.
And there's another aspect to that, and that is that the cruder you get, the more disparate the creation is, and limitation gets involved.
Yes.
So where you can go towards Prampurush is infinite. You can't have too much Prampurush, but as things are diversified, all of a sudden limitations come in, and selfishness becomes deprivation.
And the crudification gets into things like statistic. When we want to start talking about the subtlety, what is it, and statisticity, and so on. This is a whole other dimension that we could get into on this discussion for sure. But I think that. So I hope I've tried to clarify.
Yeah, I think I'm ready to go to the next
All right.
level. I just
So-
want to get out.
All right. So I know Robbie asked me on the phone, but there's another piece of this is that that which in Neohumanism it talks about this term sentiment, and so I want to say something about sentiments, but as a way in, I just want to say in the text it talks about socio-sentiment and geo-sentiment and human sentiment. There's tribal sentiment. There's and so on. And to take Atmasukha Tattva a little bit and say, so what is selfish is not just an individual thing. That which counts as myself can be my family, it can be my caste, it can be my group, it can be my nation. So it can take the boundary of the self, if we want to call it, can get expansive, if you wish. It can be humans, and so on, but that still creates a boundary within the integrated infinite creation. And then if we try to enforce that, it leads to dogmas. We have all these rationales to explain this and that and the other. Baba spends a lot of time talking about the need to use rationality to identify these false theories that create what he calls artificial differences as opposed to the fundamental kind of dharmic differences. But in any event, so selfish isn't just an individual thing, so these sentiments. But I want to say something more fundamental about sentiment that I think is important. And then I've got to get back to my dog thing. Okay, all right. So when you hear sentiment, what is it? What do you think of? What is a sentiment?
Excuse me?
Sentiment. What is this? What is sentiment?
This is what always gets me. I think it's a bias.
Bias.
A sentiment can be a heartfelt feeling, that's all.
Heartfelt
It's an
feeling.
emotion tied with a perception of reality.
An emotion tied with a perception of reality.
I mean, if I'm feeling sentimental about something or someone, sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. When I hear sentiment, I hear sentimentality.
Okay. Yeah. Well, sentimentality is like even. Yes, absolutely.
Sometimes anger is where that sentiment
Anger.
is based from.
So all of these things have aspects of sentiment to them. Right? So how can it be that there could be this bias and yet this heartfelt intention? And so I think the emotion piece is a key to this. Is that so? If we want to, so sentiment at its most fundamental core is a kind of psychic outburst. It's a propulsion of mind. Okay? Psychic outburst is the term Socrates. Okay? But it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. So this has to take on what's called an occupation. It has to be directed or channeled in some way. How does psychic energy get channeled? Think of your training acharyas or tattvikas. What is it that channels psychic energy? How does it get expressed? So this emotion piece, I think, is key to understanding it.
We have some
Dogmas.
scars that drive.
There's some scars that are part of this. That gets into some subtleties we're not prepared to discuss today. But
Dogmas.
what's the active kind of what's the channeling device or the directing device?
Well, it's sadhana. It's the effort to control the mind, to focus the mind on something.
And why
specific.
do you control the mind? Because if you don't, what happens?
It's like a bunch of
Mind
horses pulling a
controls,
chariot in every direction.
All right, and those directions. So there's this term vrittis.
Yeah, there we
These
go.
are
Okay.
the occupations.
emotions are.
These are
Yeah.
the occupations that it can take.
Mhm.
Right? So if we don't cultivate our spiritual practices to sharpen our mind towards, and this is why this idea of pinnaling the intellect, like creating a pinnacle, creating the sharp, straight path right to the nucleus. Right? If we don't, there's all these other occupations that our mind can take, our emotional states, let us say. And then these, and if you think about someone who's a dogmatic, who is, we think about the role of theories. What do theories do? They whip up, they
Reinforce
they
dogmas.
reinforce these emotional states. They create and they instigate people. They get them kind of riled up, and then people manipulate how the mind is working towards some end. I believe, I didn't write it down, but Baba says that what dogma does is that it works up sentiment towards its own particular ends to reinforce itself. So it's working this up.
Would you like to talk more about, is it vrittis controlling the mind or vrittis channeling the psychic energy?
Vrittis are the expression of mind.
Those are they're like they are the. Socrates uses the term occupation. It has to have some kind. I like occupation because it suggests there's some kind of productivity happening. It produces a state or a particular outlook.
Each vritti has its own little job.
Has like a job,
Yeah.
right? And so being able, but they're there. We can't just eliminate why the constant need of practice, constant need of cultivating the strength of, and so on is important, so that it gets proper guidance. Right? And so the reason I mention this in this kind of emotive or affective dimension is if we want to understand how is it that, I mean, think about like these people that get all, like my nation is the best nation, or my group is the best group. It's they work up these emotions into this kind of story that they tell themselves. And so if we want to understand that, we have to fundamentally see that there's a deep kind of sentiment, there's a deep psychic expression or even longing that's taking place there. But it's being channeled in this direction that's very limiting or exclusionary, and so on, and leads to problems. So part of neo-humanism or educating, and Baba says this very clearly, he says we must identify some of these demons and chameleons who utilize these sentiments and stir up the people towards certain nefarious ends. And so a piece of neo-humanistic practice, a piece of using our rationality and logic is to pierce through these false theories and stories and to identify and show how they are false and irrational. Because sentiment here is irrational in a sense, yes.
Would you say that sentiment gives rise to dogma as a way to support it, or that dogma
creates sentiment.
creates an...
This is kind of like a chicken and egg question,
Yeah.
because dogma rests upon sentiment, but sentiment, dogma rests upon it, but it reinforces it. So it's really a chicken and egg question.
But I think there's an important part, and that's why I say perception of reality. If you have a perception of what is real, and you're given 5 different dogmas, and you have an emotion tied with that perception, it's going to pick the dogma that comes closest to your perception. So it's not just a chicken and egg, there's also a selective process that goes on with your mind.
I would argue that sentiment is going to arise.
It has to.
And that for most people the sentiment's there first. The dogma is kind of like the rationale for the sentiment,
Exactly.
that which reinforces it and gives it some kind of truth value,
Right.
as it were. But yeah, maybe I'll.
Yeah,
leave
let
it
me
at that. But
just, don't have well-formed thoughts, but I see so many people who, they grow up in a certain culture, and they assimilate the dogmas of that culture.
That's right.
And then they operate out of sentiments that, well, they did not have pre-existing sentiments that then selected those dogmas. There may have been those who, for their own Atmasukha Tattva ends, perpetrated certain sentiments or certain dogmas to support certain sentiments. But it seems to me that the mass of the people, these dogmas are instilled by religion, by political ideologies and so forth. Then it becomes an operating framework within their mind. It is not perceptions that is goading those dogmas, that is goading those sentiments. It is the dogmas.
So, and then,
Can I just say one
yeah,
thing?
yeah.
But then how does the renegade come through and fight against the dogmas? Because he has a perception that's different.
Well, and there's operation of vidya there, of knowledge, of discernment,
And
of
that's part of
discrimination.
your perception of reality.
Well,
And where does that come from?
but that is rationality.
So yeah.
In what you described, is it possible that the samskara acts as what produces a sentiment that draws one to a dogma in an environment?
That's true, but he said he already gave the ground rules here.
Okay, alright.
Leave some scars out of it.
Yeah, but
Good try, brother.
But there's one underlying thing here about the whole thing. what you're saying is that you have a rationale, the rationale, or one that's very close to it, and and so the dogmatists say they have their rationale, and so you have to prove to me that your rationale is better than.
Yeah, I mean, for me to say I am rational, you're not, is a sentiment.
My dogma is better than your dogma.
I have a two-word answer to that. Baba says.
That's right. This is really important because the key to what Ravi said, I agree with you, we are born into cultures, we are born into things. And so a key concept that Sarkar introduces here that has not been explored enough is the idea of the mental complex. Okay?
Meaning,
The mental what is a mental complex? So he talks about fear complexes, superiority complexes, and so on, and that these give that dogmas give rise to these complexes, and people take on these complexes, and they live in fear and so on. But it's a very psychic. Most exploitation is psychic, okay, and it's through these mental complexes. But mental complexes do not just reside within the mind. Mental complexes are reinforced in the institutions through which we move. And the example that he gives in Liberation of Intellect is that of the signpost. When you have a dominating culture that imposes its language on the people, and then you have the local or vernacular language, it's always, he gives in his example, it's always in real small print down at the bottom of the sign. Whereas the dominating language is up, and so on. Now, this example comes from India, and we could just talk about where it comes historically. But think about, substitute for signpost TV shows, history textbooks, commercials, whatever it is you want. The images in the media, there's certain dominating images, and then someone else's image is always small and looked down upon. And so my point is that the mental complex is reinforced all around us all the time. It's a kind of institution. He gives another example of some people can ride in certain parts of the train, others have to go to a different train car. So like segregation is a kind of institutionalized form that reinforces a certain psychic structure of superiority and inferiority. And this is constant and repeated. And so if you are born into that, then your sentiments are really shaped in many respects by that complex of dogmas that's reinforcing that. And so it's to reinforce Ravi's point about the role of culture. It's going to shape how you perceive reality, because you're going to learn to perceive it through these complex states that you're born and educated in.
But
In
again,
other words, your selfish, your thirst for happiness is going to take the form of desires that are reinforced within that world around you. So part of Neohumanism is how do we re-educate desire, or re-educate the thirst for happiness?
And this is, perception may be a part of it, but I know so much of what happened in the 60s was we had to deconstruct the cultural, what we'd assimilated through our culture
Yes.
that gave us a certain worldview. We had to tear all that apart to find what was real.
That's right. So
And that's what goes on in struggles for liberation. It's not just, we all of a sudden perceive that there is something different, but we may perceive that, and that may be a part of it. We may have seen black people on the streets getting water hosed down when they were simply trying to register to vote. But then we had to do some deep analysis, some deep study to figure out what are the mechanisms of society that set up this reality.
and I would argue that analysis is changing your perception of reality.
But here's the thing. But Sarkar gives us tools to understand this as well.
Huh?
So what Ravi's talking about is a kind of shedding.
Yeah.
Okay, it's like onions. You got to peel off the layers that you've been taught to get to the core. And what's the core? Well, the core is always the ground state. What's the ground state? The ground state is the cosmic. We get back to what is our goal? What is this, and so on. But so many of us are so wrapped up in all these other concerns and attractions and so on that we can forget that, or we're not so good at getting there. So we have to peel back a number of these psychic institutions, these complexes that we're born into. Now, and I have a little, my fancy wordplay here to talk about. This gets into the question of clash. And what is clash and what is cohesion? What does that mean? So we think of clash as this kind of like, boom, and so on. It is an aspect of that. But clash is just when we run up against something. I like to think of it as when I run up against something that reminds me of who I really am. In other words, it challenges some preconceived notion. This is where we get to bias, perhaps. It challenges a bias that I didn't know I had. Because I'm suddenly learning there's something different that's not part of my perception of reality. And that makes me have to stop and rethink what my reality might be in this kind of clash. It's because of that. I have to work through that. And so it's not just that I'm trying to call out what others are doing, but I have to call out what's inside me that needs to be shed away, and so on. I'm going to get off if I keep running. I'm going to come back to that if I can. But there was, what was this other point? Sarkar gives us a tool here, and that is, he talks about something called demi-social consciousness. Demi, what is demi? Half. Demi means half. Right? So another philosopher, he doesn't use this term, but another philosopher uses the term demi-reality. Most of us, most people, and even myself a lot of time, I'm living in demi-reality. I am perceiving things that are happening and so on, but like the division between black and white, the division between rich and poor, these are like false artificial differences propped up by things. But that's not our true reality. Our true reality is the supreme consciousness, the unifying, integrated nature, and so on. But that demi-reality is real. It causes people to act and do things. It reinforces stories in our head. It reinforces dualisms. Me and the other. Rich and the poor. Matter and mind. And so on and so forth. So it's a kind of demi-reality. So the question then, this gets into some complexity I do not have time to unpack right now, is when you say perception of reality, what is the reality that you're perceiving? Is it the ultimate reality? Or is it a kind of demi-reality that's been built up, a kind of crustification, a kind of false skin? There's other things, like people that do the history of where racism comes from, where the concept of race comes from, they talk about it as like a false skin. It's like a false reality. But it has real causal powers. It causes people to think and do things. But we have to, so it kind of gets at this, but I'm getting into arenas that I don't have time to toss out today. But clash, the reason I want to mention clash is so this idea of using logic and rationality to see through sentiments, this is partially what clash is. We have to identify what those are, we have to see what the dogma is that reinforces them, and then this challenge that Anandam's given me, I have to somehow demonstrate or prove that my rationality is superior. That's work that has to be done. Part of our educating is to do that work. And once we do that, then what Baba talks about clash is a good thing. Clash is how we get to more subtler awareness and understanding. If you beat it down into powder, or when you spin fiber and you really spin it out, that's when it gets even more integrated and strong. And so he also talks about what do we have to do to dogma? Dogma is like a snare, it's like a prison. We have to bust it up. We have to break it up into pieces. We have to use our powers of rationality to engage in the work of clash or critique or shedding, bust it into fine powders, and then in those people that express the dogma, that have these sentiments, we have to remember our namaskar? There is a core of truth to all those beings. How do we help recover their authentic, true nature? Even Donald Trump, I'll use my United States example, how do we recover that base divinity in a person such as that? to bring them along in Samasamashtattva. This takes real effort. I don't have an answer to that for Donald Trump. I just know it has to be done. It's one of my favorite singers says, everyone deserves music. Everyone deserves the vibrational movement of Samasamashtattva. My liberation is bound up in your liberation. This is part and parcel of, I think, this work to do. Baba said, can I say one more?
Oh, sure.
Baba, there's a few quotes on this. Self-awareness arises as a result of clash. The awareness of my deeper self, my deeper truth arises when I have to confront something, an aspect of my reality I didn't realize was part of my reality. Yes? And Baba says clash is the sustainer of devotion.
Whoa. Why'd you laugh, Ananda?
Clash is the sustainer of devotion. And then there's my, and I'll get to this, then my favorite quote. This is my favorite one. Devotion can only be cultivated due to rigorous penance through action and knowledge for lives together.
Wow.
Okay, so lives together, Samasamashtattva. Rigorous penance. What is penance?
Is that, you think it's like tapas?
I've always thought of penance as service that hurts. It's like if you do service at a soup kitchen and just serve food, it's not a big deal. But if you struggle to get a soup kitchen open, or you're serving people who swear at you, but you keep doing it, and you have to really dig deep to be able to do it. That, to me, personally, that's my definition of penance.
I think of it as atonement for your sins. I mean, growing up Catholic, you do penance for
Atonement for our
something you
sins.
did wrong.
So think about it. Think about Ravi's notion. We're born into a world, we learn certain things that are demi-true, demi-social consciousness, demi-reality. If we want to shed that and do all the work of that recognition, that takes a lot of work. And then there's a kind of penance. If we gain that understanding and knowledge, we can't hoard it in the ivory tower of our mind just for ourselves and our group. We have to go out and serve and help educate others so that they in turn can do that for themselves and see that same truth, that same goal. Our rigorous penance is our knowledge in action. It's our seva. It's utilizing that mind. It's utilizing all of our acts that we do to cultivate conditions that allow people to realize that same integrated truth, that unifying consciousness themselves. So I see it as, yes, atonement for the kinds of sins I didn't even realize I was committing because of the complex, crappy institutional structure into which I was born. But I can't just be like, oh, I don't like that. I have to do something about that. And so tools of Neohumanism, tools of PROUT, and so on become instruments that we can use to do our rigorous penance. Yes.
Can you go back to that word and call it working through samskara?
Working through samskara.
I was just going to say that when you were talking about, clash and being this positive force, I was thinking of the, racial divides in our country in the, recent years and the clash that's come of that, and it's created this realization for people that have this institutional understanding. We're just born in this framework, and we know that there's maybe some inequality, but really looking at this concept of white fragility and white privilege and that's creating some extreme reactions for some people of like, that's not true, this is not, I don't have privilege, versus the people there are a lot of people actually doing the work now, unpacking that, and what does that mean actually, and how do we treat other people, so that just came up as an example.
That's yes, it's an example. I could say much on that, but I don't know. The first revolt against dogma, the first revolt against dogma was and still is devotion.
How so?
Because Papa says.
2 words.
Devotion to
Why?
the bowling score?
Why? No, why? Because devotion is born of that fundamental love of all unifying reality in all its different manifest forms. And if we cultivate that, if we run with that, samastapa, but if we run with that, that becomes our strongest weapon against dogma. To be able to recognize those moments, those ideas, those actions, those thoughts in our own mind that try to create some kind of boundary in reality that is not really there. That makes this artificial distinction. It's when that arises. So the devotion is always this constant giving and surrender of oneself to Brahma Purusha.
So are you arguing that ultimately what we are struggling against in our penance is to overcome the constraints on devotion?
I would think that that's probably an ultimate argument.
So when you have a peak experience of devotion, everything is one, and it's glorious, and you see God in everything. So in that sense, I definitely agree with you.
And one of the things it takes to do this work is courage. Tremendous courage. Courage to call out dogmas and false distinctions. To recognize them in oneself honestly and to work through them like illusions. But devotion can sustain that clash, or that clash will sustain our devotion. It's how we grow, it's how we expand, it's how we flow, to take it back to rasa and vistara. And then we do the work of helping others, seva. This brings us closer to our goal. There's one last thing to say on this. Robbie kind of mentioned these earlier with instinct, but something about movement. We all have drives. Movement's driven by things, and there's 4 fundamental drives. Instinct, logic, actional faculty, and goal, or that which is desired. Neohumanism provides us with tools or capacity that can raise or elevate sentiments to devotional sentiment, to channel sentiments towards devotion. Logic or rationality can eliminate the influence of things like geosentiment that tries to confine us within a certain kind of sense of what is self and what is not. Psycho-spiritual goal or clear vision can help us overcome like socio-sentiment or groupifications or demisocial consciousness about what counts and what doesn't. That kind of clear vision. And then actional faculty, this is, I need to do some more work on this myself, but actional faculty is what helps us overcome bondages. There's 3 aspects to actional faculty. One is the intellect or the faculty is being ideation on Brahma, ideation on God. The second is to surrender all of our actions to God. It is not me doing the work. I am just an instrument that Brahma Purusha is using to do the work. And the third is not to be attached to the results of my actions, of my work. To be detached from that. And these are really, really hard to do. But these 4 things, Sarkar suggests, are what helps create a kind of proper balance of prana. to overcome the kind of deranged thinking, the disruption of our words or actions, and the kind of ultimate degeneration that leads to. But to move that in this other direction, vidya, to move this in another direction is kind of maintaining the problem. Yes.
What was the first drive?
Instinct.
Instinct.
Where does the inherent desire for expansion come in as a main drive?
This would be, I think, part of this idea of psychospiritual goal, or deserdatum is the word that some people use.
I think what we have here is a little bit different wording for the four primary vrittis located in the Muladhara chakra.
I think that's
One of which is Dharma, and Dharma has these different facets, including the stars you said.
So, last thing I guess I'll say is the stages of Neohumanism. This is something I'm working on getting a good description of, but what's being described is this term that's come up recently, and I think Robbie probably mentioned this notion of metamorphosis. That there's a kind of change occurring. And so metamorphosis is moving from like pupa to adulthood. So could we say that neo-humanism is the moving of humanity from a state of kind of, it's through a process of maturation to adulthood? But is this another way of saying that we are not yet fully human? That we need to achieve it?
I agree.
Yeah.
Some people.
One,
Yeah.
metaphor that's been used with some of us who've been impacted by the intuition writings is that we are moving from adolescence to maturity. In adolescence, there becomes the strengthening of there's the individuation that is going on that is very strong, that is not yet sublimated into the sense of responsibility for the broader social grouping. So in that sense, humanity, there is a kind of humanity that is there, but it is not a mature humanity that is yet able to function in that mature state of consciousness, collective consciousness. I'm just saying the same thing in different metaphors.
And as you said before, your spiritual development in life is really based on what was the phrase you used? Based on all of our development. And it's the same with the social. You need to see my social development based on the social development of all of us in society. If we look at it that way, then we've got lots of work to do.
There's an old Greek term for this, oikomonia, which
What
is
is it?
oikomonia. It's an old Greek word, you can look this up. What it means. Look that up.
Just tell us briefly, what is it?
Oikomonia.
Please.
Oikomonia is that it's essentially that my liberation cannot happen without your liberation. The liberation of each is the liberation of all, the essential meaning of it. That's not to say that there cannot be individual liberation that people can achieve, but ultimately for humanity as a collective, it has to be all.
I have a little topic area that I'd like your thoughts on, and some expanded thoughts on. We talked earlier about part of what needs to go on is through a process of maybe psychic clash. We have to tease apart, deconstruct these dogmas that we've been acculturated into. We have to work with others who have these, even if we've that, moving beyond them. And I know in liberation of intellect, there's a process given for overcoming of sentiments and the dogmas that support them. And for one large category of sentiments, there's the emphasis upon study. So rationality is a big, but it is not simply rationality. There's an understanding that rationality itself is not bulletproof.
Correct.
There can be defects, right? And there may be defects in information when used to base one's thinking on. So there are two further steps that are given, as I remember. One is you have to first kind of come to your rational understanding, but then you have to apply conscience.
Yes.
And then you have to further see whether what you come up with really has benefit in the world.
Correct.
Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, it's a three-step process. So the first is to study. So what is happening? What is the nature of it? Who's involved? Who benefits? Who loses? So on and so forth. Where does it come from? What's its history? So on. How is the dogma rationalized? Who supports it? All these kinds of things, yes?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next step is that when it comes to then what to do, there's a question of using rationality to weigh the pros and cons of any particular approach. So we have to overcome peak oil, so therefore we should develop solar and wind and so on. Well, we have to weigh the pros and cons of these. I'm just using a very specific example. So, and determine which is positive, which is negative, what has greater benefit. The criteria being what promotes the welfare of all. This is the ultimate criterion. Baba is emphatic about this. What promotes the welfare of all? He uses this criterion to throw other theories out into the dustbin industry. They sound great. They come in as blazing meteors, so on and so forth. But if they do not promote the welfare of all, they are defective. So this is the criterion. Our rationality can help us determine that. It's not easy, but it can be done. And then the next one is that it has to actually be put into practice. You have to implement it. It's not enough just to have a firm understanding of the situation and what the best approach is. We have to put it into action. And then there's actually others, not in Liberation of Intellect, but in other discourses on Viveka or conscience. There's other subtleties to this, but that's the ultimate. So it has to be feasible. You have to put it in practice. So that requires, as a term he likes to use, you have to chalk up your plans.
Chalk out your
Chalk out your plans. Chop them up, chop them out. Chalk them up on the board, chalk them out.
That sounds
You have to,
familiar
like,
to an architect.
You have to plan, you have to design.
Yeah.
And so this moves us from a kind of critical mode of dissecting and discriminating what's going on into a more creative, design-oriented mode. Okay, so now, praxis of liberation. What is praxis of liberation? It has a deconstructive, shedding, discriminatory side to it, but then it has the constructive, design, creative side to it.
Praxis? Praxis?
Praxis, Praxis.
Yeah.
So praxis has to have this constructive side to it. And this is an area where we have a lot of work to do because most of our intellectuals, most of our scholars are all about critique and deconstruction and identifying the problem and the history of it and all. We have so much of that. But where's the creative design? How do we imagine that? So one of the benefits of PROUT is that it lays down design principles that can orient our thinking towards that work. Okay? So in a way, what Neohumanism is about as a guiding philosophy is it prepares the ground for design work. It clutters away all the debris of false theories and dogmas and gets that out of our way so that we can clearly see the reality before us. And then PROUT provides a kind of design framework to then construct a new social edifice in that clear ground, so to speak.
One way of depicting that that's recently come through some guidance is that the PROUT is the practical implementation of Neohumanism.
Yeah.
How do we make it?
What is
In the social realm.
in the social realm? Because remember, a mental complex is not just in the mind. I mean, the mind is more than just in your head. The mind is all.
Neohumanism clears the minds, lays down the values,
Yes.
and then giving the and then you have the
Foundation.
impetus, and
But-
then the movement in the social realm becomes proud.
Then you have, and then the stage here is to elevate humanity. And so, but you have to create the reinforcing structures and institutions that constantly reinforce that elevated mind through our daily actions. Without that, then it just becomes, we come to a class, we get elevated, but then we go back out into the world of illusions and divisions and inequalities. But we have to recreate that as well to facilitate. What is the word facilitate? I mean, what is the ultimate thing here is to facilitate our subjective approach to Parma Purusha. And spiritual practices are a key means for this.
It seems to me too that we need to be trained to be able to take a defective social situation, then analyze what is the Atma Sukha Tattva at work here, what is the social pleasure, what is the gain that somebody is getting, the selfish gain. Then what is the socio-sentiment that gets utilized,
Yes.
and what is the dogma that
Yes.
sustains that?
And what is the mental complex that keeps the oppressed participating in that society? Yes? And that reinforces those who have superiority to keep doing those acts. Because
And
many
what
of
is
them
the-
are well-intentioned but don't realize what they're doing.
And what is the mechanism by which the brainwashing is presented to the
This is
public?
a way to think of it. So I want to add, I think that I mentioned this idea of a mental complex is very under-theorized in Neohumanism. It's not even often mentioned, but it's crucial to understanding the mechanism that reinforces what goes on. He gives lots of good examples, like the thieves. Thieves participate in a certain kind of behavior, and you can recognize another thief because there's a code of conduct that you recognize. We create codes of conduct or norms. Decorum, how we socially interact, reinforces those relationships. That's part, and it's all in our mind. When you get in an elevator, do you face the doors or do you turn around and face the people? Right? Try it as an experiment. Get in and face the people instead of the door. It's very uncomfortable. But that's a code of conduct that reinforces a certain order. Right? I mean, it's just a simple example, but he gives lots of these.
Well, what about in the discussion of pseudoculture? Does not the complexes come up in
Pseudoculture, so part of the complex is that is a kind of pseudoculture, yes.
Define pseudoculture.
is imposed culture?
It's imposed culture, but it can't be thought of as, it's not that you come in with whips and chains and clubs and guns. Now that happens. Okay, that's brute force. But it's not, but eventually it becomes a more subtle force, psycho-exploitation. And this comes in the form of,
Economic
there's just, yeah, there's, hegemony is the key term because the oppressed actually take on their oppression. They actually participate in the society
Culture.
and it reinforces their very oppression. This is a complex thing that
Movies, media.
but pseudo-culture then becomes this subtlety, it becomes this complex in the mind that reinforces inequalities and divisions and so forth. But it's imposed. Now in many places, and then I'll come to you, John, your hand's going up. In many places that's initially, you dispossess people of their culture, but over time you try to build it up.
I just wanted to say that the system of discernment that Robbie points out in breaking down
Yeah.
what we have currently goes the other way as well, and helping us to prop up and be able to keep up a system that allows us striving towards the goal once we have infrastructure built.
Yes.
And you know, maybe as an example, the same tools that are used to disseminate dogma can be used for that, as they have been before and are currently being used, maybe just not as widely.
What did Baba say? If the proudest controlled television, they could create
Absolutely.
a revolution in 5 days.
It's not the means itself that's the problem. It's the logic, it's the rationality, it's the goal behind it, the inspiration behind it. All of that it's the psychic nature of it that is the problem. And so absolutely. So Atmasukataka, where is it? How do we see it? What are the dogmas that support it? What is the kind of mental complex that reinforces it in the minds of the people through the stories they tell themselves, through the common sense that they think is just the way the world is, and so on, what they take for granted, unpacking these things, and then what's the sentiment at the heart of it,
And who are the controllers of it?
and who controls it. He talks about this a lot, identifying them and the strategies they use, the ways they manipulate people, and so on. These are all important elements of this work. But then there's this creative dimension to it as well. But as I'm suggesting, one reason why coming in with really good ideas like PROUT, for instance, does not always sink in or connect with people is because there's so much detritus, there's so much veils in the way of their thinking. They can't see
And
what it
remember-
offers.
Remember, one of Baba's ideas is for PROUT to create a sentiment that can attract the people. And utilizing sentiments that we create in order to guide them in the right direction.
Baba says sentiment may or may not be rational. There's benevolent sentiments, emotional sentiment, of course.
Yeah.
There's a variety of sentiments and occupations of our psychic power that can be utilized to do good work.
So in terms of the context of, I don't like using the word history, but of human story where we're at right now, are we in a place where we can start building PROUT at a large scale, or are we at a place where we're breaking down so that we can do that?
Both.
Okay. And can you go into that a little bit?
How much time do we have?
We're
I
about,
have as much
we're
time
about
as you
30
want.
minutes past.
I've been
schedule.
watching, and people might need to, that I started with movement, you might need to move, stand up at
Yeah,
least, but,
sure do.
I had one quick
yeah.
thing, because there's a lot of Baba said this and Baba said that, but about mental complexes. Is it true that Baba says between the two mental complexes of superiority and inferiority, the best complex to have is a superiority complex?
He said he imbued the Dadas with a slight superiority complex to allow them to work better.
Like if you were going to have one or the
Look at
other, it's better to feel a little bit superior to not
Give you confidence.
to give you confidence to go out there and change things. If you're feeling inferior, is that true, Ravi, or is that?
I didn't hear, I'm not.
I have heard that.
I heard that said of someone in our community, a leader, a great leader in our community in Liverpool, did tremendous things. He had a superiority complex, and the Acharya looked at him when he first met him, and he thought, dang, this guy's got a really big superiority complex. And he said to me, you know, better superiority than inferiority sometimes. Got locked down, and then he left.
Yeah.
You know, but he'd created a lot, so, you know.
I don't remember where I heard that because I thought, oh, if you're going to have one, it's better to feel a little inferior and feel a little bit humble and not subjugate other people, not dominate other people.
I would
but
say this, if you have